actually. And I'm going to talk about the current and future trials of transcatheter mitral valve repair and replacement because actually Grube is going to speak a lot more replacement, so I'm going to just combine both together. So the treatment of MR, as we clearly realized, especially from the last talk, will require a toolbox. And there will be a role for both replacement and repair. And repair, where possible, is obviously preferable, I think in both spaces, whether in functional or degenerative. Replacement will always be required when it's a non-repairable valve, when you have a combination of mitral stenosis and mitral regurgitation, and maybe in some categories of functional MR. So the percutaneous therapy of MR, if you look at it in general, mitral valve repair is considered a standard therapy for selected patients with severe MR with an excellent safety record, a compatible efficacy and durability at least up to 4 to 5 years. That's all the data that we have in MitraClip. And there are several percutaneous mitral valve replacement devices which are still in first in man. Now, if you look at the commercial landscape of what is available right now for us, how do I get this off? Click off it? Oh, click out there, okay. So for MitraClip, it's now approved for both primary MR as well as a primary DMR from 10/24/2013 prohibitive surgical risk, which just goes well with Anu's talk. And then for secondary or functional MR, it's been approved since March of this year for all surgical risks. So I think that's really important that the FDA recognized it, that it was irrespective of surgical risk. The SAPIEN 3, of course, has been approved for mitral valve-in-valve for high or greater surgical risk patients. Now, what do we have in the investigational space? If you look at this landscape, in the pivotal space, we have Intrepid, we have Tendyne, we have Carillon, Cardioband, Neocord, MitraClip, and Pascal. And for early feasibility, we have a ton of valves like Neovasc, EVOQUE, CardioValve, HighLife, Circulage, M3, MVRX, Caisson, Acucinch. Some have already been died. So we start with the 4th generation MitraClip, MitraClip G4, which got approved in the US without a trial, which has some additional features which makes it important for usage. First of all, it has wider arms. You actually have 2 sizes of each. So you have an XT, XT wide, you have an NT, NT wide. You have a controlled gripper actuation, which allows you to grasp leaflets independently or actually optimize leaflets. You have a continuous left atrial pressure monitoring system, and you have a delivery system which is better designed to capture leaflets. This is actually the first patient in the world with the MitraClip XTR, which I had the fortune of doing in Los Angeles. And you can see this was a flail P2. The patient was a Jehovah's Witness, was 76 years old, and you can see, in addition, she had mitral annular calcification. So we went back and forth and decided, I think, whether we should do surgery for this patient versus a clip. But the patient asked me this one question. He says, if you treat it percutaneously, I don't want to come back in 5 years, and you've got to get it to trace MR. So we used one XTR wide, and you can see that's the torrential eccentric jet. Patient received a 1 XTR wide, and from torrential it went to trace, so much so you can see the smoke in the left atrium, which looks pretty scary. And what is more important, that the patient's ejection fraction was borderline. It was like 30 to 40%, and just immediately after clipping, it went down to 25%, and then we just brought it back, and it was okay. And this patient, of course, as you mentioned before in the previous lecture, to make it for a cure, the next thing that the patient is going to get is a left atrial appendage occluder. So that's what we're going to do next for this patient. And so we think that this patient will last, and it will not be just a palliation, but actually a cure. And you see the gradient is only 1 millimeter with a wide bridge between A2, P2, and let's see how she does. So this is just an example of the new generation. This new generation is going to be studied systematically in a new clinical trial called Repair MR. And that's going to be, for the first time, we're going to randomize patients with intermediate surgical risk to mitral valve surgical repair versus MitraClip. And the inclusion is any patient above the age of 75 or patients between 65 and 75 with a few risk factors. Going to the next one is the Pascal implant, which contains 3 differentiating features. It's got a central spacer, it's got broad contoured pedals, it has independent leaflet capture. It's the safe device, it's CE mark approved, it's investigational in the US, and is a randomized study in MitraClip. And you can see over here, this is the 2 arms of the class trial. Class 2D prohibitive risk Pascal versus MitraClip, and then class 2F, which is Pascal plus GDMT, versus MitraClip plus GDMT for functional MR. Neocords are another repair technology which have been studied, and it's a transapical device. It's ideal for isolated P2 prolapsal flails, not great for multi-scallops or anterior prolapsal flail. And this is undergoing a randomized study at the present moment in the US versus for low-risk patients, neocord versus open surgical repair. And a transeptal approach has just been designed and is going to be tested soon. The Carolina and the Cardioband devices are interesting. They're indirect and direct annuloplasties. And I think the whole thing is the COAP trial has affected their designs very effectively. So for the Cardioband device, the actual trial is now on hold. So they actually are not randomizing versus clip. And the Carolina indirect annuloplasty is randomizing it to a sham-controlled study. And after 6 or 7 months, if they still continue to have symptoms, then they can get a MitraClip. And Samir has left because he's the PI. I think this is a very unethical study. I mean, why would you wait for 6 months to randomize it against a sham control when you already showed, Greg showed, that the symptom benefit or a MitraClip started immediately within 10 days. So it doesn't make any sense to me. So anyway, this study is going on. And then finally, transcatheter mitral valve replacement studies. I'm not going to go to details of any of these studies because I don't have time, but the 2 apical studies are the transapical Tendyne and the Medtronic Intrepid. And I'm just going to show you the difference between these 2 studies. They're both transapical devices. They have different sizes. One is 36 and 35 French. But the difference is in the randomized control arm. In the Summit trial in the Tendyne, where the patients are predominantly patients who are functional MR, they're randomized to the MitraClip. So this is a tall order that they've taken. They want to show that absolute reduction of MR versus just reduction of MR will be better because remember, they're going to be transapical. Whereas in the Apollo trial, they are randomizing it to mitral valve surgery. And what is bothersome to me is that the control arm, which I mean, both the populations are in a significant population of functional MR patients, and so you're randomizing it to a control arm which has not been proven to be effective. There's no definite data to show that surgery is the right treatment for functional MR. But since this is New York and David Adams is the PI, I'm not going to argue too much about this study. So, and then of course you have the study on mitral annular calcification, both in the Tendyne arm as well as in the Apollo arm. There are other transeptal early feasibility trials, and Abraham's going to show some of them. The EVOQUE, the M3, the CardioValve, the HighLife. They're all in early phases. This is the Edwards SAPIEN M3 system, where you have a ring that captures the leaflets, and then you put a SAPIEN, almost like a SAPIEN 3 with a cuff inside it. Then you have the EVOQUE mitral valve system, which is a system which captures the leaflets and the cords, maintaining anterior septal permission, and it's now shorter, and it's based on the cardiac Q valve. And this is just one example of this patient, which is done entirely transeptally, and it's a 28 French system. There are only 9 cases done with this system, and the results have been quite good. But this is what I want to end with, and this is a slide that I took from Professor Chung Fu from the FDA as to how should trials be now designed. So if you have a patient with DMR, what should you do for these patients? So if you see that the patient is prohibitive risk, if it's yes and it's a clippable anatomy, the test therapy should be MitraClip, and the performance goal should be against GDMT. If it's no, then the test therapy should just be medical therapy. But if you are not a surgical risk and your surgical risk is low and your ejection fraction is greater than 30%, and if you're repairable, then surgical repair should be the standard. That should be the control arm, and any other therapy should be controlled against that therapy. And for those where the EF is greater than 30%, but the valve is not repairable, then the standard of care should be replacement, and that should be the control arm. Now, for functional MR, it becomes more interesting, especially following the COAP trial. So you can see if you have a patient who's got secondary MR, who's got a clippable anatomy, and the surgical risk is not prohibitive, then it becomes a decision whether you want to do GDMT as a control arm. Now, if your EF is between 20 and 50%, and the LV ventricle is not too large, the MitraClip plus GDMT should be the standard of care, and any other trial in this category should have MitraClip as the control arm. On the other hand, if you don't fulfill these criteria of EF and you're out of boundaries, especially if your EF is too low, then potentially the control arm should be GDMT and the test therapy should be against GDMT. So therefore, most of the patients will actually fall in this category, EF between 20 and 50%, and therefore, most of these functional MR studies should have MitraClip as the control arm. So I just want to end by saying repair versus replacement. Percutaneous seems to be technically more complex than mitral valve repair. In most patient cohorts, surgical mitral valve repair results in superior outcomes than replacement. So I just want to conclude that transcatheter mitral valve implantation, oh wait, actually I made it wrong. This is not the right conclusion, it didn't follow, but what I'm trying to say is that transcatheter therapy, transcatheter mitral valve repair is become now the new standard of care for high-risk primary MR as well as secondary MR. There are other technologies which are following suit and will be effective, and all other therapies have to be compared against a control, and definitely the MitraClip should be considered as one of those control arms, especially in functional MR studies. Thank you very much.